Good evening, everyone. This is our presentation about implications for English language teaching. To start this presentation, it is necessary to analyze the three models provided by Kirkpatrick 2017. The first one is the native speaker model. In this case, the native speaker is the role model in teaching. Classes are taught monolingually. It's partly advantageous for people who plan to study abroad, but not completely advantageous. And non-native teachers are required to teach a model which they themselves don't speak. The second one is the endonormative nativized model. In this case, multilingual competence is enhanced, is exploited, and recognized in the classroom. Teachers understand language learning problems. Non-native English teachers or bilingual or multilingual English teachers is the case here. Local teachers are far less likely to promote Anglo-American values. There are more cultures around the world. And one of the disadvantages is that there are no grammars or textbooks based on this model that we know that these grammars or textbooks are based on native speakers models. And finally, the lingua franca approach, that is the ideal model promoted by Kirkpatrick. In this case, students would need to be alerted to which linguistic features cause problems. We have to talk about international English phonology. The curriculum would need to focus on how cultures differ. ELT should be framed within the goal of creating bilingual and multilingual citizens, and ideally teachers must be bilingual and multilingual as well. In the next slide, Tamagara had to touch on 5 complements Kirkpatrick's argument. The author talks about glottiscapes that basically mean transcultural flows, flows of culture, media, technology among communities internationally. We have to take into account that English right now is used mainly in multilingual contexts. These glottiscapes have an impact on English language teaching. That's why language proficiency has to go beyond American or British English. Teachers have to orientate to English as an heterogeneous language, and they need to negotiate variation in the classroom. That's why, for language teaching right now, teachers need to develop their practices. They need to develop agency to enhance their linguistic diversity, to use interpersonal strategies in the classroom, rephrase, clarification, gestures, or topic change, and move away from the grammar and traditional system to the pragmatic system of communication.
Continue with the presentation, we need to rethink today language ecologies. Understanding language ecology are the study of languages in relation to one or another language and the different social factors. The first one is curricular program building. We need to adapt school curricula to the students' needs, selecting teaching contents and methods that are appropriate to the local context. The teaching professional development, identify and analyze the quality of an effective teachers. The unequal language practices, the discrimination on the basis of the language. It might happen. Sometimes the language can marginalize different cultures. The number 4 is multilingual proficiency. And multilingual students require multilingual teacher. So that is important that the teachers, native or non-native native speaker, will be well prepared, and also because they are going to face or being in a multilingual classrooms as well. So the international mobiles, we need to attract and key highly educated talent from across the globe. But it's not only from across the globe; it is the local one. So that is important to analyze the policies that the local context is implementing. Just to know that the teachers prefer just going to a different country and continue their professional development, but they just have to stay here.
Now, to explain this information, I would like to start by saying that unless we change our descriptions of how languages function in society, we have to include subaltern understandings and embrace a more comprehensive view of education beyond schooling. We are negating the human potential for open communication and educability as a lifelong process. In this sense, I want to introduce 4 subtopics: translanguaging, also called code switching, that it describes bilingual contact from the perspective of the language itself and perceives it as a deviant from standard language practices. And language socialization, that is the participation and not simply as transmission. It is steeped in practice that shifts in response to negotiation with the social context and participants in which the interaction takes place. Diglosia, as the societal arrangement in which one variety of a language or one language is used for prestigious or high functions. It is important here to highlight that the process of bilingual acquisition is stable and dynamic, and it has a strong relationship with transculturation. Transglosia makes reference to the ways of speaking of subaltern groups that had been previously fixed with static language identities and that are constrained by the broader colloquial word system. So to finish with elective bilingual and circumstantial bilingual, the elective bilingual is when speakers are involved in formal bilingual learning and planned bilingual acquisition. And circumstantial bilingual is when people who became bilingual simply by living in the language context. That's the image that you have. So just to finish with this part, I would like to say that informal planned or unplanned bilingual acquisition is totally related with the practice of speech in a community of native. So I mean, second language due to the language learning takes imitation, observation, and individual trial and error. That's why English learning is more natural in a real immersed context rather than a formal bilingual learning.
Taking word lingua franca into account will affect language policy creation in 3 aspects: motivation, pedagogies, and expectations. In terms of motivation, I refer to the intention or interest for choosing and making English teaching a priority compared to teaching other foreign languages. Some examples of motivations are the assumptions that English can be used as a tool for upward mobility in education or the job market. English can be used as a meditational tool to exchange and construct information or to respond to the demands of globalization. On the second aspect, such motivations lead policymakers to incorporate international pedagogies and approaches focused on standard or static English. For example, the implementation of communicative language approach, which not always fulfill the context needs and realities, and benchmarks for evaluating students' language level, which do not report what test takers can do with the language in diverse contexts. And lastly, the expectations can be high, attractive, but unrealistic or unachievable when at creating a language policy and setting the language competences goals, little room is left for fair distribution of investment in professionals and sources for developing the programs in all regions and contexts of the country. Such inequality in economic, linguistic, and human resources that public and especially rural educational institutions have to deal in order to reach the proficiency goals lead to an assumption that English is an elitist resource. Now, even if English language teaching were accessible to all, including to indigenous students, this can marginalize them and threaten their indigenous language, as has happened with Spanish teaching, as a consequence of working with a material curriculum and assessments that are not adjusted to this community to preserve the culture, beliefs, traditions, and language variation. Therefore, Amar Mahbub, after identifying the world Englishes tends to focus on particular aspects of language variation and do not fully account for the range of dynamicity of linguistic variation, he proposes a model of language proficiency, teaching English to dynamic language, to recognize and empower local and endangered languages. Teaching English as a dynamic language is an attempt to contextualize an approach of English language teaching that acknowledges and promotes language variation and language diversity. At implementing this approach, teachers will help the students to acknowledge the importance of language variation as these develop high thinking skills at exploring the language and working with it in activities for everyday context and for technical and specialized use. The opportunity given to students to identify and get familiar with other types of languages variations would enable them to do more with the language learned. Thank you for your attention, and here we finish with our reference.